All right, hi everybody. Hopefully you're all doing great out there. In this video, I will discuss the philosopher John Locke. So what I want to do is get this larger, is capture Locke the man and philosopher a bit, just like I did with Hobbes. And then I want to discuss Locke's political philosophy from the Second Treatise of Government. And then not in this video, but the next video, whoops, I'll discuss the connection of Locke to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. So to our Declaration of Independence, 1776. Okay, so that's big picture what we're going to do. So we'll accomplish 1 and 2 in this video. Okay, so again, hopefully you're all doing great. Thanks for watching this. Okay. So some brief biography. So there are his dates, 1632 to 1704. So he's living, you know, it's quite a bit of overlap with Hobbes, but you might say in the generation after him. And Hobbes should be in the backdrop for thinking about Locke's political philosophy, as we'll see when we get to it. But another British philosopher, another Oxford-educated philosopher, where he focused on philosophy, logic, classical languages, and also medicine. So John Locke was a physician, in addition to being a philosopher, a statesman as well, and had connections to the Carolinas during the quote-unquote colonial period, and was a governor of trade back then. So just like Hobbes, Locke, he ascended to a secretary position to a person of political influence. This was Lord Ashby, who was the Earl of Shaftesbury. The Earl of Shaftesbury was someone who was a constitutional monarch. So, typically those who were on this side of things back in Locke's day and even Hobbes's day, they were arguing that the monarch's power needed to be constitutionally limited. So they were typically arguing for kind of check and balance system. So very often they're kind of lumped in the parliamentarian view, or the parliamentary side of government plays a role in checking the power of the monarch. And so Locke was deeply influenced by this relationship. As a secretary, he's like a tutor, he's an advisor to the relevant powerful figure. So this means that Locke's on the parliamentarian or the constitutional monarchy side of things. There's some who think that Locke was arguing for democracy. Perhaps in an indirect way he was, but the way he was by putting checks on the power of the monarch. Be definitely opposed to Hobbes's view of absolute monarchy. Okay, so nowhere in the Second Treatise of Government, which I had you look at, really does he explicitly defend democracy. Okay, more to be said on that, but remember the English Civil War. There were times in Locke's life when it wasn't safe for him to be living in England, just like it was for Hobbes, but it was when the parliamentarians were struggling against the monarchists that Locke wasn't safe in England. He went to Holland for a time during his life, but the English Civil War ended in the 1650s in some sense, but there were conflicts and issues until really 1688, 1689 with the Glorious Revolution there. And the Glorious Revolution was what led to the establishment of the constitutional monarchy system, where you still have a monarch, but over time became much more of a figurehead in England, but it was checked by the parliamentary system. So the parliamentarian side ended up defeating the royalist side in this way. And then Locke wrote the True Treatise of Government. He published them anonymously, and published them in 1689. And the first treatise of government is basically a negative work. It's a work showing like why the divine right of king's view fails. So if you remember when we were discussing Hobbes, we said Hobbes rejected the divine right of king's view. So does Locke, and Locke's first treatise of government is devoted to that. And then a second treatise of government is designed to develop his positive theory, his theory of a checks and balance system of political authority. Okay, so that's just a bit of background that may help with his biography and a little bit of his philosophy, but then in big picture, in terms of his philosophical worldview, Locke, you might say, has a more conventional metaphysics than Hobbes did, in the sense that he believed that there were two different kinds of objects that existed. So that makes him what we call a metaphysical dualist, as opposed to a metaphysical monist who thinks that only one kind of thing, one kind of object exists. For Locke, there's two different kinds of things. There's material things and immaterial things, or physical things and non-physical things. Human beings have souls, minds. So oftentimes souls and minds are used interchangeably in the tradition which Hobbes is writing in, or which Locke is writing in, and Hobbes. So human beings have souls, those are immaterial things, and we also have bodies, which are, of course, material things. And God is, according to Locke, an immaterial being. So remember, we saw that Hobbes argued that that God is to be understood as a kind of interesting, material being, different from the way we're physical, but still physical nonetheless. And Locke's epistemology is empiricist, so he thinks that we're born with blank slates. Our minds, our souls are blank slates. And the concept here is tabula rasa, which just means blank tablet or blank slate. If you read some Steven Pinker, he's challenged this kind of worldview. Thought is that we're born with much more in our minds than just blank slates. But anyways, setting aside Pinker, but that may interest you, as a work called The Blank Slate. He's an empiricist because he thinks that we gain knowledge fundamentally through sense experience. Okay, all our ideas come from sense experience, and then a reason can operate on the ideas that we gather from sense experience. His ethics is a natural law theory, so he's in the tradition that Hobbes is in. Has an altruistic version of natural law theory, which means that among the fundamental natural law principles or ethical principles are altruistic principles, principles that are other regarding, not merely self-regarding. So you get a sense of them. We talked about three of Hobbes's. Let's just talk about three of Locke's. So law of nature number one is the law of nature. The law of nature pertaining to self-preservation. So fundamental command to self-preserve, and then thereby a right to self-preserve. Law of nature two is the preservation of humankind, not just the preservation of our own life, but the preservation of others. So Locke thinks that inasmuch as all human beings are created by God or creations of God and God's property, then because of our kind of value that God creates us with, a significant kind of value, and thus our lives are worth preserving, well then so are the lives of others worth preserving. Now we don't have to sacrifice our own self-preservation to help others self-preserve. That might be wonderful to do. That might be the highest thing you can do, morally speaking, or the best thing you can do, morally speaking, in some cases. But you're not required to. You're not commanded to. So the second law of nature is a fundamental one in Locke's system, but it's other regarding. Okay, and it's based on the idea that we're all God's creation, we're all God's property, and God makes us with all the same absolute worth. So remember, we saw with Hobbes that we only have conditional worth, not this absolute kind of worth. But for Locke, we have an absolute kind of worth. We're all made by God morally equal. Okay, that doesn't mean that we all have the same moral beliefs, the same moral values. It doesn't mean that we're all morally the same with respect to how well we act in the world. It just means that there's something about our worth that is equal, morally speaking, such that before God, we're all morally the same, even if, I'm worse at lying than you are. Okay, just to give an easy example. Or even if I have different moral beliefs, like I might think that it's never acceptable to torture someone ever, and you might think that in very rare cases it is, especially cases where we have a known terrorist on hand, and we're trying to save that terrorist from successfully bombing 5,000 people who are in Central Park, New York, or something. Okay, so we can have different moral beliefs, different moral values, but still be morally the same in terms of like our inherent worth. Okay, which does serve, like in the Western tradition, anyways, as the basis for equality. Okay, so anyways, then there's the uh, third law of nature, which is non-subordination, which means like in our natural state, no one's better than anyone else, no one's superior to anyone else. No one is subordinate to anybody else. Just means that no one is beneath anybody else. You know, it's not until like we create a political society to where we say some have the right to rule over others. Okay, but in our natural state, no one's subordinate to anybody else, and morally speaking, nobody's subordinate to anybody else because we all have the same worth. Okay, so Locke writes this on page 3 of the Second Treatise of Government, STG, really modern translation. Everyone's obliged to preserve himself and not opt out of life willfully. So for the same reason, everyone ought, when his own survival isn't at stake, do as much as he can to preserve the rest of mankind or humankind, and except when it's a matter of punishing an offender, no one may take away or damage anything that contributes to the preservation of someone else's life, liberty, health, limb, or goods. Okay, find sometimes block sentences difficult to parse because they're long, lots of commas and semicolons. But the point here is that we do as much as we can to self-preserve. Now, what does that amount to? He doesn't specify here, but perhaps it's a pretty weighty obligation that we have, or command that we have. Remember, the natural law gives us commands. Saw that with Hobbes. Locke agrees. Okay, so we should preserve the humankind as much as we can, except when it's a matter of capitally punishing someone. Okay, so capital punishment ends up being acceptable when perpetrators they inflict states of war on people when they attempt to force another beyond the right to do so. And he gives the case of a thief attempting to overthrow someone to take their belongings. When that person does so using violent means, the individual in question, the victim in the situation, has no reason to believe that the perpetrator won't also kill them. So, in those cases, killing the thief, the would-be thief, is acceptable, permissible, all things being equal. Okay. So this just helps us capture the first two laws of nature in a way. Remember, the crucial thing is we're all God's property. In a sense, our lives aren't our own. They're God's lives, and so we have to, and they're valuable, and we have to preserve that which is valuable, that which is God's. And other people's lives are valuable, just as ours are. So do as much as we can to preserve them. And um, of course, we're not required to in cases of capital punishment. Locke has a view, according to which we can capitally punish. Those would be cases where someone forfeits their right to self-preservation, cases where we have perpetrators inflicting very serious states of violence on people. Locke says people act under the laws of beasts in those cases. So to understand, this is another passage from the Second Treatise of Government. To understand political power correctly and derive it from its proper source, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, what all people are naturally in. In this state, men are perfectly free to order their actions and dispose their possessions and themselves any way they like without asking anyone's permission. Okay, dash. Is subject only to the limits set by the laws of nature, by the law of nature. Okay. So this gives us Locke's theory of freedom. Okay. So remember Hobbes says everyone has a right to everything because no one has a right to anything. Everyone has a natural right to everything because nobody has a property right to anything. Here's Locke saying you do have the right to a lot, but not to everything because the law of nature, um, like the natural law in our natural state, is still binding on us, subject only to the limits set by the law of nature or the laws of nature. And this is in a state of nature. You may have noticed that Locke considers Hobbes's theory or theories like Hobbes's um, to be theories of license, not a theory of uh, liberty. So the way Locke understands it is that Locke is giving us that Locke himself is giving us a theory of liberty, which is the proper theory of freedom, and thus understood, um, liberty is something moral. It's constrained by morality, living in accordance with the laws of nature. Whereas Hobbes is giving us a theory of license, a theory of doing whatever we want, right? Unbounded in a way by the law or the laws of nature. Okay. So think about the difference between Locke and Hobbes here as a theory of liberty versus a theory of license, respectively. So that gives us, if this passage from the Second Treatise of Government gives us Locke's theory of freedom, then let this give us his theory of equality. The judicious Richard Hooker regards this natural equality of men as so obvious. So Richard Hooker is another philosopher that Locke is referring to here. Of men so obvious and unquestionable that he bases it on people's obligation to love one another, on which he builds their duties towards each other, from which in turn he derives the great maxims of justice and charity. The maxims regarding being just and loving towards one another. Okay, so perhaps in line with something like a golden rule, Locke and Hooker belonging to a broader theistic Christian conception of the world. Um, so, so this natural equality is a moral equality that we share, and it provides the basis for obligation to love one another. Of course, the source of our natural equality is given to us by God, and then the obligation comes from God through the natural law to love one another. Okay, one way in which we love one another is by helping preserve each other's lives. Okay, the way we love ourselves fundamentally is by keeping ourselves alive. Okay, so we're to be loving and just towards each other. On Locke's view, I think that drops out of thinking about equality, our moral equality, and he cites the judicious Richard Hooker, as it were, to defend that idea. Okay. So let's turn to Locke's theory of the state of nature. So he's like Hobbes and thinks that like we start there, and that's going to help us with thinking about people moving from a state of nature to a political society, which will help us think of not just about the nature of a political society where we have hierarchical structure of a political kind, but also we'll learn what justifies forming political societies in the first place. Okay, so it's not that there's not hierarchies in a state of nature for Hobbes and Locke. There are. It's just that they're going to be natural hierarchies. Okay, so in case that's not clear, I didn't emphasize this in talking about Hobbes, and then I haven't said it yet with respect to Locke, but they both can agree that there are hierarchies, natural hierarchies in the state of nature or in states of nature. Okay, but the relevant hierarchies in political societies are the are the political ones where we talk about the rulers and the ruled, or the sovereigns and the citizens, the princes and the subjects. So here's a passage that helps capture a crucial feature of Locke's state of nature. So what's central to a state of nature is going to be there's no common political power. So Locke and Hobbes are going to agree on that. I've tried to capture so far just two central differences, differences between the idea of freedom and equality. Okay. And this will be another one, another crucial difference. So that all men may be held back from invading the rights of others and from harming one another, and so that the law of nature that aims at the peace and preservation of all humankind may be obeyed, the enforcement of that law of nature in the state of nature is in every man's or every person's hands, so that everyone has a right to punish lawbreakers as severely as is needed to hinder the violation of the law. For the law of nature, like every law concerning men in this world, would be futile if no one had the power to enforce it. Okay, so go back here, right? Locke is saying that even in our natural state, the laws of nature hold. Okay, and that means they have to be enforced because Locke accepts principle E that we talked about when discussing Hobbes. Principle E, remember, was a law is binding only if it's enforceable. So if the laws of nature, if morality generally holds in a state of nature, in an external kind of way, then there have to be enforcers. Locke can agree with Hobbes, and I think he does quite clearly that that the laws of nature, they're always internally binding, in foro interno, remember, because there's God who is the ultimate source of judgment there and the ultimate source of enforcing there. So what Locke is saying here is that we have enforcers of the laws of nature. Everyone has a right to punish lawbreakers. Everyone has the right, then generally it would seem, to enforce the laws of nature, whether that's by punishment or some other means. So 5 quick notes before moving on and um, and really trying to understand this claim by Locke. He ends up claiming that this is a strange doctrine. So he understands that what he's saying here is a little tricky, not something that Hobbes would agree with. Why? Big picture, because who's the earthly authority? Well, is it everyone? Well, how do you establish that everyone has the authority in a state of nature? And again, we should be thinking about the state of nature as Locke thinks about it. And a non he does admittedly he's not very specific about this, but I think the context reveals that it's kind of a prehistorical version of a state of nature that Hobbes was dealing with. And as people go from that kind of prehistorical state where there's no political hierarchy to political hierarchy, well, what's the story? Well, we start with the state of nature and go from there. So 5 quick notes here. 1, Locke's theory of a state of nature is that of a state in which there is no common political power. We know that. 2, Locke focuses on a prehistorical version of a state of nature. I just mentioned that. Okay, just like with Hobbes. And 3, Locke claims that the laws of nature are both internally and externally binding. So that's different from Hobbes. Remember, Hobbes said that they were only internally binding, not externally, because there's no external enforcer. But 4, by 3, Locke argues that that a state of nature isn't essentially a state of war, which means that it's only contingently in a state of war. Okay. How so? Well, if the laws of nature can be externally binding on us because there are external enforcers, namely everyone, then the state of nature doesn't have to be a state of war. It can be. It sometimes is, sometimes isn't. That's what the contingently means. So essentially means it always is, has to be that way. Contingently means it only sometimes is. It doesn't have to be that way. So this means that a state of nature can, at times, be a relative state of what? State of peace, which again, we saw Hobbes would disagree with, because Hobbes thought that there's a state of nature, which essentially is a state of war, and all of their states, political states, are states of peace. And then 5, by 3, there must be enforcers of the laws of nature, and we've already seen that that's everyone. So enforcers in a state of nature, here's the passage that captures the argument, I think, to some degree. I think it's a tricky passage. So this is from chapter 2. This is on page 5. So no doubt this will seem a strange doctrine to some people, but before they condemn it, I challenge them to explain what right any king or state has to put to death or otherwise punish a foreigner for a crime he commits in their country. So he says this idea that there are enforcers, external enforcers in a state of nature, and it no doubt seems a very strange doctrine, as I anticipated, to some people. Before they condemn it, before they say that it's wrong, okay, I challenge them to explain what right any king or state has to put to death or otherwise punish a foreigner for a crime he commits in their country. So suppose a foreigner goes into a commonwealth and murders someone. Would the prince, the sovereign in that political society, have the authority to capitally punish said foreigner? Locke is saying that seems foundationally true. So then he continues, the right is certainly not based on their laws, through any permission they get from the announced will of the legislature, for such announcements don't get through to a foreigner. They're a foreigner, meaning they're not privy to the laws. They're not subject to the laws. And even if they were, he isn't obliged to listen. He isn't obliged to listen to the laws. Why? Because he's a foreigner. Okay, so that's the passage. And here's the intuitive formulation of the argument. We'll call it the prince foreigner argument. Okay, just to give it a tag. Since a prince has the authority to punish a foreigner for wrongdoing, then it must be a natural right for everyone in a state of nature to enforce the laws of nature by means of punishment or other means. Okay, so the idea here, let's go back to the passage. Isn't it supposed to be that the foreigner is in a state of nature relationship with respect to the prince or the king in question? I mean, the bit over here on the right-hand column seems to capture that well, doesn't it? Why isn't he obliged to listen to the laws? Because he's not a citizen. He's um he's in a state of nature relationship with respect to the foreigner. I mean, with respect to the prince or the king, as this text has it. In other translations, the prince is used. So the prince is just a general term used for a sovereign. To think about Machiavelli's The Prince, which you may have read in high school or maybe sometime in college. Okay, prince is a very common term used. Hence the name of the argument. You can call it the king foreigner argument if you wish. So again, since the prince has authority to punish a foreigner for wrongdoing, which he's taking as like a matter of political fact, then it must be a natural right for everyone in the state of nature to enforce the laws of nature by means of punishment or other means. Well, if the prince has the authority to punish a foreigner, that must be because, in general, it's acceptable in a state of nature relationship to enforce the laws of nature. It just must be a natural right that's had by people in states of nature. Here's another way maybe of running the argument. So here, there's kinds of states of nature. I've tried to anticipate this in the Hobbes video. Now we'll do so here in the Locke video, but I'm making it maybe a bit more explicit. Is you have, a state of nature that maintaining between individual and individual. This might be the most seen or best seen in cases of people living in prehistory, as Hobbes and Locke seem to focus their work on this kind of case. Okay, but there's also the individual relationship to the political society. That's the foreigner and the prince example, or the king example. And then, of course, there's to be political society in relation to political society. All that's needed is that there's no common political power. That's what the gaps here are supposed to represent. There's no common political power associating them with each other. Okay, and the way of perhaps running the prince foreigner argument that might be helpful is you argue for the acceptability or the permissibility of um, of enforcing the laws of nature, punishing um, wrongdoers in a state of nature in the second case, and say, well, if it applies here, then it also applies here. Of course, it also applies in the third case. But I think Locke, like Hobbes, is focusing on the prehistorical version of the state of nature in order to get at sort of the origins of our move to a political society in their exploratory works and developing their political philosophies, foundations of the political philosophy. So again, the move would be to go from two the case where you have individual in relation to political society, and the relevant member of the political society would be the prince or the king, who will have at his disposal the capital punishment means or other punishment means. I think that's why the prince or king is used in the example. And if punishment or enforcement of the laws of nature is acceptable in the second case, it's also acceptable in the first case and the third case. But the relevant one for our purposes right now is back up to the first one. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And then it turns out there's a ripple effect of the prince-foreigner argument. So, so the enforcement of the laws of nature in the state of nature results in there being bias in the enforcement of the laws of nature in the state of nature. So in our natural state, we won't quite have good enough institutions to prevent bias from seeping in to our judgments as we punish people who we know less harshly than we punish strangers, etc. Okay, so there's bias, but that also might result from the way in which everyone is sort of a judge in their own case also, and so then that might lead to bias in enforcement in a state of nature, and that's bad according to Locke, that kind of bias, because that means we're not living justly toward one another, right? You're not just if you're not punishing in proportion to the offense that's been caused. See how that would go? So Locke is quite clear in the State of War chapter, which I had you read, that when we think about punishment, we need to be thinking about punishments that we would give when we're thinking about things calmly and rationally, okay, not ones that we would think about when we're immediately angered. So we're gonna have a bias problem. We're also going to see, as a result of the prince-foreigner argument, supposing it succeeds, that the state of nature is only contingently a state of war. Why? Because there's the enforcement of laws of nature and a state of nature, so only sometimes will the state of nature be a state of war. It might not always be. Why? Because people will be able to enforce the laws of nature in their own case and to help other people around them. So that may prevent others from being attacked or others from being afraid of constant violent death, etc. And then another ripple effect is that people can have property in a state of nature. In a chapter I didn't have you read, chapter 5 of the Second Treatise of Government, Locke gives his account of property in a state of nature, and that involves mixing one's labor with the relevant property, with the relevant land. So it's a labor theory of property. Okay, so we can have property in a state of nature. Of course, we can also have it in a political society. Okay, so these three things seem to follow from the prince-foreigner argument. So supposing it succeeds, Locke puts himself in position to develop not one, not two, but three arguments for leaving the state of nature based on thinking about the prince-foreigner argument. So that prince-foreigner argument ends up being a kind of a linchpin to Locke's establishing political authority, right? Establishing political hierarchy, where some have the right to rule and others don't. Okay, so one, there'd be much more bias in enforcement of the state of nature than in a political society. So what Locke wants to say is that this gives us reason to leave a state of nature for a political society, again, because we have very general obligation to be just towards one another. And we're not just when we're biased in enforcement of the laws of nature. And so this is the first argument that he offers. One thing that we'll do is we'll learn from the biased nature of our enforcement in a state of nature of the laws of nature, and try to create political institutions that are less biased, are more just, or create, right, a justice system that's more impartial, as we sometimes say, less biased. And the way you do that is you have third parties be in charge of judging cases and doling out punishments. So that's one. And then what Locke says immediately on the heels of arguing for one, uh, at, at the end of the second chapter, is that what we better not do is form an absolute monarchy, a Hobbesian absolute monarchy. And the reason for this is because a monarch is, just like everyone else, human, and human nature is to be biased. So the sovereign would be biased in his or her own favor and not be very likely to seek the interests of others. Okay. Um, in fact, Locke claims that we should just stay in a state of nature, then form an absolute monarchy. So it's not as if all other states are states of peace, as Hobbes says. Can get out of the state of nature, form political society, state of peace. No, it's you might say it's kind of state of war to form an absolute monarchy, okay? Because absolute monarchy do whatever he or she or it wants to do to you. Okay? Politically speaking, okay, you have the moral right to self-preserve, but good luck with that, as we've seen. Okay, so that's the first argument. Second argument. So you see, the first one's a comparative argument. We compare what justice will look like in a state of nature versus in a political society. Okay, relevant justice is, punishment justice, enforcement justice. And then the two other arguments that we see are also comparison arguments, given that um, the Prince Form argument succeeded. So two, states of war are worse in a state of nature than in political society. So a state of war is a state of force beyond right. Okay, so a state of war for Locke, given its contingent nature, can exist in both a state of nature, but also in a political society. And states of war are likely to be worse in a state of nature than in a political society. Why is that? Because we'll learn from the states of war and the state of nature what institutions to create when we create a political society in order to make states of war less severe. Okay, try to prevent them as much as we possibly can as well. Okay, so that's another consideration. Given that states of war can occur in both a state of nature and a political society, we need to examine where is the state of war likely to be better, where is it likely to be worse, and then go from there. Okay, and let the way we define state of war is just a state of force beyond right, as I've claimed. He defines it in other ways, as like the state of enmity and destruction, a state of subjecting someone to absolute authority, these kinds of things. Okay, so what are the ways in which a state of war would be better in a political society than a state of nature? Well, when we establish relevant political institutions in a political society, we're likely to have fewer states of war, they'll last less time, and we'll be able to get reparations for those who for the victims of states of war, better than we would be able to in a state of nature. So that's the second argument. The third argument is a property argument, given that we can have property in a state of nature, again, by mixing our labor with the land. And he goes on to make other claims, like so long as we're also not hoarding, okay, the resources are designed for our material well-being, our material survival. And so we can't hoard them, because when we hoard them, we prevent other people from getting them and thus surviving, and then we're violating the second law of nature. But given that we can have property both in the state of nature and the political society, because property rights as a kind of political right are enforceable. So but property can be better protected in a political society than a state of nature, once again, because we'll be able to create the institutions that protect property better when we form a political society. So when you're living in a state of nature, you can have some property, but you might struggle to protect it, even if everyone has the right to enforce property. Okay. So in cases of states of war being worse in the state of nature than political society, Locke claims that in many cases when someone perpetrates a state of war on a victim, all the victim can do in many cases is just throw their hands up in the air and say, "Dear God, help me." And then, well, good luck with that. So we need to learn from these states of nature. And I think these are, again, the prehistorical versions. We learn from them like what kind of political societies to create. But likewise, when you have property and your property is attacked, there's overlap here in these arguments. Like the state of war seems like it's been inflicted upon you, and in many cases, in a state of nature, all you'd be able to do is just throw your hands in the air, say, "Please, God, help me," or "Someone help me," you'd be crying for help, but no help comes your way. So again, we're going to want institutions that protect property. So we're going to likely develop law enforcement agencies. We're going to develop them in such a way that they can do regular patrols and that they can come when emergencies are occurring and apprehend suspects, perpetrators, et cetera, et cetera. And then once apprehended, such individuals can then be charged, and then they could provide the relevant reparations to the victims, right, in proportion to the harms that they've caused to their victims. Okay, so Locke's original contract. Let me see what's going on here. Let me see if I can fix this. Let's bold and see what happens. So that's not helping. I don't know why it ended up doing that. Let's see if black or oh, there we go. Let's just try that. So Locke argues that there are both horizontal and vertical agreements at the foundation of political society. Okay, so maybe I'm going a little too fast here. Let me slow down. So here we have the justifications for establishing political society. We have the legitimacy of the political society, but now we need to form the original contract. Okay, the foundational contract that establishes the political authority that creates a sovereign with citizens. Well, Locke's like, we gotta learn from Hobbes, and we gotta learn from, absolute power and how it corrupts absolutely. And he claims that it's true that there's a horizontal agreement among the subjects, the citizens, but there's also has to be a vertical one. So the power of the sovereign has to be checked. And know what this means. This means that the power of the sovereign is not absolute, so it's not absolute. And this preserves the citizen's right to revolution, because it will mean that there's a contract holding between the sovereign and the citizens. And the citizens can then say, okay, you sovereign, you're breaching your contract. And if you do so sufficiently poorly, then we're going to reserve the right to overthrow you, violently or otherwise. So the political right to revolution, to overthrowing a tyrannical leader, so a tyranny, to be tyrannical means to use political power beyond one's right to do so, okay, according to Locke, is acceptable, okay, on Locke's view, okay. Now there's questions about how Locke might respond to Hobbes's argument that we saw, this argument that maintains that there's no one sovereign over the sovereign. We would need someone sovereign over the sovereign in cases where there's a breach of contract and then a dispute over that, even including when the sovereign disputes the charges that the citizens have leveled against them or it. I'll just say this very briefly. I think that what Locke's second treatise does is, in kind of indirect way, is try to establish a checks and balance system to where you don't have to have a sovereign over the sovereign. You just have to have the relevant checks and balance system within the sovereign domain itself. Okay, so that's sort of the genius, I think, of Locke, and then subsequently the founding fathers. Okay, as we'll see, it's creating a system of checks and balances is a way of dealing with Hobbes's, at least at face value, a significant challenge to those who claim that the power of the sovereign should be limited. Okay, so we'll connect some of this to the Declaration of Independence, as I said in the next video. The last thing I want to talk about from Locke, besides what we'll say in response, what we'll say when we connect Locke to the Declaration of Independence in a future video, so I want to talk about his view on slavery and discuss his slavery argument. So it seems, doesn't it, that when you read the Locke, you get the sense, gosh, these guys got a view that makes slavery absolutely forbidden, okay, because everyone's going to have this absolutely significant worth, um, and um, and given that we're God's property, we can't be anybody else's property. So it would seem. And then Locke says this. This is the slavery chapter, which I didn't have you read, but it's a very short chapter, and he gives this line of reasoning for slavery, for the permissibility of slavery. So he says, if someone performs an act that deserves death, he has by his own fault forfeited his own life. The person to whom he has forfeited it may, when he has him in his power, delay taking it and instead make use of the offending man for his own purposes. It's a very general claim. And this isn't doing him any wrong, because whenever he finds the hardship of his slavery to outweigh the value of his life, he has the power to resist the will of his master, thus bringing the death that he wants. Okay, so when he resists the will of his master, the master can bring death upon him because he chooses death over slavery. Look at choice. Okay, not a very robust choice, right? So what I've been discussing is the condition of complete slavery, um, which is just a continuation of the state of war between a lawful conqueror and a captive. Okay, so the connection between what Locke says on the left-hand side and the right-hand side is a little tricky. So is the case of the continuation of a state of war between a lawful conqueror and a captive just one kind of case that establishes acceptable slavery, or is it the only case that he has in mind? Okay, we would have to settle that. It's just that's a question that's worth asking and thinking carefully about. Okay. Um, so this last part of the passage here puts Locke squarely in the just war theory tradition uh, of of justifying slavery. So there are some who, as political philosophers, they've tried to lay out like when are wars just? Okay, so there's one question, like, when is it just to go to war? And one common set of answers as well in cases of self-defense and cases of other defense. So imagine, you're a country and you're attacked by another. Well, the country that's attacked has, as victim, has the right to defend itself and thus engage in war with its aggressor. Okay. Likewise, if some other country wants to come along and help a victim country, well, they can declare war on the aggressor country, it seems. So unless we want to be like, extremely pacifistic, right? We're gonna accept that in cases of other self-defense, a political society, legitimate political society, can defend itself by going to war with an aggressor perpetrating country or group, political state. Okay. So um, so there have been some in the tradition who have tried to use just war theory or an extension of just war theory to advance the idea um, of justifiable slavery, whereby those who are on the perpetrating side of things, the enemy combatants on the aggressor country, or the aggressor political society, are subject to being killed, but then um, to be enslaved in lieu of that. So if they can be killed, these enemy combatants, they're aggressors after all, then they can be enslaved, is the argument. Okay. And I know that sounds awful. That sounds awful when you hear that, like, killing and enslaving. Most of us are okay with killing, even though that's awful. That happens. That's just the nature of war. But in a way, Locke and others in this tradition were laying out um, um, arguments for how to deal with enemy combatants in these states of war, like when you have all these enemy combatants that are, say, captive, okay, um, what do you do with them? Historically, uh, such people were treated terribly. Sometimes they were just straight up massacred, and then the women were raped, and so, and then maybe murdered, and then many of the enemy combatants were just, or the many people who were captured were just left behind. You know, they weren't like prisoners of war and then taken care of thereafter. They were just slaughtered and then buried. So there are some in the tradition who are like saying we need to like morally improve upon that. But here's one of the ways that you do. Instead of massacring people, right? You enslave them, you put them to work, and then, as you can imagine, in this tradition, some come up with like principles for being a just slave owner, if that's not an oxymoron, or just, yeah, principles for treating slaves, right, in correct, just ways. Okay. Um, Obviously problematic notion, but in some ways a significant improvement upon just the massacring model. Okay. So the thought would be people in the past thought we could massacre them. Well, isn't it better just to enslave them, keep them alive? Okay. And then it could be a win-win. They could be kept alive, which is better than being massacred. And then, but of course, then the people who enslave can also be benefited. Okay. By no means is that a justification. It's just an explanation of like how things have progressed historically. I'm thinking about the justification for slavery. So the argument appears to be this: since it's permissible for a lawful conqueror to kill an enemy combatant, it's also permissible for the former to enslave the latter in lieu of killing him. Okay, and if the argument's more general than that, it might be, since it's permissible to capitally punish someone for doing severely wrong, for perpetrating a state of war, then it's permissible to enslave the perpetrator of a state of war instead in lieu of killing him. So we can generalize the argument if we wanted to. But there's an assumption here, isn't there, that's significant, and it's that slavery is on a moral par, or it's morally equivalent to killing. Okay, slavery is on a moral par with killing. So that's what would allow us to claim, would admit that um, we can enslave in lieu of killing. Okay. Some might even, assume that slavery is better than killing. Okay, but all one needs is this weaker assumption, but the stronger one might be one that folks assent to here. Okay. Okay. Now imagine you're with me that there's got to be something wrong with this argument, because it ultimately means that slavery is permissible. Um, it, um, I'm guessing that all of us, we think that slavery is absolutely wrong. Okay. There's debate on this in the tradition, just like there's debate about whether or not there are some very rare cases to torture someone. There might be some very rare cases to enslave someone. Okay. But I think by and large, and particularly people who aren't steeped in thinking about like weird philosophy cases, they're going to say, yeah, no, slavery is absolutely wrong. Think about American history, and that definitely leads us in that direction, doesn't it? Um, so what's the weak link? Is it that a lawful conqueror can't kill an enemy combatant? Is it that that I can't kill someone who is trying to kill me, supposing I'm the innocent victim in the case? That's not the way of going, right? Um, um, Again, you have to be like extremely pacifistic to argue that. So it seems like what's brought back with the argument is the assumption that slavery is on par with moral killing. So here's like the class response to this assumption, and it's that slavery just might be morally worse than killing because it belongs to a different moral category. Why think this? Here's one way of thinking about it. And it's not decisive, it's just one way of thinking about it. We, you can be hard pressed to think about a case where we could justify enslaving someone, but you can't. You're not going to be hard pressed when thinking about a case where it'd be acceptable to kill someone. Okay, or acceptable to kill someone. So the case of self-defense is the clearest case. Okay. Other defense is another kind of case. Right? Someone is attacking their child with intent to kill. All things being equal, you can kill that perpetrator. Okay. Or you don't have any children, so the force of that doesn't hit you. Someone's trying to kill your mom or your dad, or you get the idea, right? So we might think slavery is worse, at least in some respect, than killing, in that there are justifiable cases of killing, making killing, in some sense, less bad than enslaving, because we can't think of a single case where it would be possible to enslave someone. Right? Maybe another way of putting this that might be helpful for some of you is, it seems like there's something that I could do that would warrant my being killed, and that'd be to go in and attack somebody. Okay. But there's nothing that I could do that could warrant my being enslaved, suggesting again a moral difference. So this assumption seems to be wrong. Okay. All right. So so in case it's not clear, let's go back here. Well, maybe one last thing on this is, as I mentioned at the outset, Locke, he worked as a governor of trade with the Carolinas. This is during the quote unquote colonial period, and maybe he had personal or political or monetary reasons for being for establishing an argument that is pro-slavery. Okay, early in his earlier works, is in the 1660s, he argued for the permissibility of slavery as well. I'm just giving you the one that he developed here in the late 1680s. So there's that. And then I want to make sure we're clear here that we have these arguments for leaving the state of nature. We form an original contract, but what then is fundamentally establishing political authority is a contract, an agreement. So in case it wasn't totally clear, Locke is a social contract theorist, just like Hobbes is. Okay. Now with Hobbes and Locke in our minds, let's go back to the Prince Foreigner argument and imagine what Hobbes would say in response to this argument. Right? Hobbes would say that the prince doesn't have the authority to punish the foreigner, because having authority to punish the foreigner presupposes something political, a political relationship, but there's no political relationship here. So he would say, look, as a social contract theorist, you can't maintain that the prince has the authority to punish the foreigner. Okay, so that'd be a challenge to Locke's argument. I didn't run that challenge earlier because I wanted to show what followed from the success of the argument, but we can always go back and challenge, and the challenge, I think, would be that, again, imagine that we're Hobbes. Now, what Hobbes can then go on and say is, yeah, I don't think the prince can punish a foreigner, but guess what? The prince can use the means of war to his advantage against the foreigner because they're in a state of nature relationship. Okay, but you, Locke, don't claim that the state of nature is a state of war. Okay, you have a different view altogether. So I'm not going to claim. So Hobbes is going to say, I'm not claiming that the prince has the authority to punish the foreigner. What he does looks a lot like punishment, in the sense that it's going to involve violence toward the foreigner for his wrongdoing, maybe even capital punishment, so some severe violence. But that's not, properly speaking, punishment. Punishment's a political notion. So I think that's where Hobbes would press on this argument. But of course, this argument fails, then Locke's arguments for leaving the state of nature fail as well. So there's a domino effect, another ripple effect on that front. Okay, so just want you to know how we think about challenging that. And then just about to the end, I know about the end there, I just want to do an application to Locke. So set aside the application to Hobbes part here. I mean, 1 through 6, once again, the nature of political society, same as Hobbes, right? In the sense that you have this political hierarchical structure. The situation of political societies, we've seen the 3 arguments that he gives that follow from thinking about the Prince Foreigner argument. The best way is to organize a political society, not absolute authority, and you want a system where there's checks and balances, right, on the sovereign. So Locke probably wants something like a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary system to check that power. Okay. Um, and the rights, the responsibility and rights of the citizen. So the same idea is going to apply with Locke here. Is when we form the original contract, we surrender the rights that we have in a state of nature, right, including the enforcement of the laws of nature, punishing those who offend, and we transfer it to a sovereign, okay, to rule, okay, um, and we're to follow the laws. The authority of the government is to enforce the laws, and they have the responsibility of making life better for the citizens. That should be a crucial function: protecting property, protecting people from states of war, and administering justice. And then, Locke's going to give his account of the way we're equal, give an account of justice towards one another, and what it means to be free. Freedom, liberty, in line with the laws of nature, not just in a state of nature, but also in a political society. Okay, so I don't have the slide application to Locke here, but I'll include it in the PowerPoint that I have over here. So that's that. Go ahead and stop there. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'm happy to help out. And thanks for watching. Thanks for showing up. Take care.